We used to drive to Poland to visit my grandmother. A very long, arduous journey when we were children. My brothers loved to laugh, and so I used to tell them ludicrous stories. I mean, very silly, extremely surreal stories. And they used to howl with laughter, and I thought, oh my Lord, But I also saw from the front seat of the car my parents breathing a huge sigh of relief that I was entertaining this unruly mob. And I suddenly saw the power that I had, as well as the enjoyment that I had in being an author. And that has kind of stayed with me. I'm forever thinking about the power of the author and the enjoyment of the audience. And that, I think, has led me to this research. I've never really believed this idea that audiences are passive. I've always believed they're very active. Barth's argument of, the author's dead, long live the reader. But of course, that's not a simple equation. It doesn't mean one is at the expense of the other. I think what it means is that both the audience and the reader are contributing at different times to the meaning of the piece.
I think my interest in the idea of an unwritten contract in terms of storytelling is to understand the role of the author and the audience and what they understand the role of the other to be.
The research aims to do a couple of things, really. One is to investigate what you might call the poetics of online or new media practices.
These types of stories are new, even though interactive storytelling has a long history. Then, what are the contracts, what are the agreements that are underlying the interactions that the audience have with the story that are provided by the author?
We've extended it beyond the sort of entertainment sphere to its health and well-being arena, I suppose you'd call it. So to see what uses it might have in mental health. New media developments allow us ever more possibility to involve the audience. I happen to live in Nairn in the north of Scotland, and I have experienced quite a lot of storytelling in this region. It's something that I really enjoy and enjoyed as a child in Ireland. And there's a great deal of research which also suggests that the oral storytelling tradition have a lot to offer in the online environment.
When the dad had finished telling the story, he said, "Now, that wee bit orange I gave you, that lasted you, 5-10 minutes? But that story I told you, that story will last you the rest of your life. So the relationship between the listener and the storyteller is really special. It is a really important thing. The listener's so much part of the live storytelling experience.
It sounds very simple, but I think you have to love the story, and you have to love the audience, and you have to see the story as a beautiful, valuable gift that you have to give to the audience.
There's no such distinction. Every storytelling is a mental health and well-being event. There is no subcategory called people are engaging in a mental health and well-being experience, because that's what storytelling is, What we were discovering in use of digital platforms was that the digital could be an in-between kind of space, a space that was between a full live presence and the isolation of an individual reflection or reading experience or whatever it might be. So in that, one of the key things that's the enabler, the storyteller then becomes the enabler, has to do is create a sense of trust and of shared space.
Technology is a double-edged creature in that way. So I think you have to be imaginative and careful about how you do it. Give it a lot of thought, a lot of experiment, and you must leave spaces.
What we've been seeing is that people say, oh no, I don't like the digital, and there's a lot of problems with the digital. But then because of COVID, they've had to engage with it. And as a result, they've discovered some really fundamental things about what works.
Most important is the harbour of stillness, so that you come back to a resting place and give the audience a resting place, and then you can canter or gallop or trot on your way.
Emily came to talk at a conference. I had never met her before. She blew me away with her articulate readings of the carnival. But while she was speaking, I suddenly thought, this is a very interesting model for online work.
I look at oral stories, and I look at the stories in their journey from West Africa through to the plantations in the Americas. And I look at how those stories have changed to suit the needs of the people who tell the stories. And so I look at how stories were adapted from their West African roots to a plantation environment. So what shifts took place in the stories to help people to become, to resist the plantation power structures and to survive within them, for how they used oral storytelling to actually create strategies of survival and resistance. In the Caribbean Carnival and in carnivals in the diaspora, we have performances in the streets, which are an amalgamation of costuming, of dance, which all have a particular rootedness in West African cultural forms, but also in plantation and post-plantation cultures. Generally, there tends to be a contract, if you like, or a relationship between the performer and the crowd, that the crowd will be waiting or ready or understand all the different types of nuanced elements that the performer is putting out there, and they will respond accordingly.
There's a real provocative element that says, you think I don't know what's going on here? Well, I do. There are characters, very well developed characters, that people understand who they are. I mean, the contract is never spoken, it's just understood. that these characters they're almost like sort of screaming ghosts that are going to confront some uncomfortable truths and past practices.
One of the reasons why I think we mostly analytically welcome the carnival, because it has this wonderful capacity of disruption. Obviously, we should always ask the question, what is being disrupted? What are the objectives? Right? We could also have carnivals that are utterly conservative and ideologically deeply problematic. So we should be a bit careful in celebrating the carnival as a concept, because it could be used in many different directions. But of course, often it's a place of reclaiming power.
Where you use the word interactivity, I might use the word relationship. I'm a dance movement psychotherapist and I'm interested in movement and dance. The movement and dance comes out of the relationship and the possibility for movement and dance and the possibility for using other forms of interaction, maybe through song, through poetry, through the telling of a story.
In every therapeutic setting, it's very clear it's very important to establish the boundaries, the rules, so that people feel safe. And I think we haven't done that in the online world.
So in order to be able to ask someone to think and talk and speak freely in a way that is genuinely creative and therapeutic, and I put the two together because I think they do reside together, you have to have a contract where it's safe to do that, but it has to be within a contained, confidential space, and everybody has to sign up to it staying within that space. It's not for outside, so it's not for a wider audience.
There's an overarching psychotherapy contract which acts as, we call it, a container for the space, so that person feels safe enough to come in.
There is a responsibility, I would argue, of care for each other, but also care for the process. And that is where participatory theory actually connects. Because in a participatory process, all the actors are responsible for the quality of the participatory process. But they also need to take care of each other.
People don't always operate the same way as everyone else, and one person's way of producing online content or setting up an online project might not be the same as another person's. So it's finding that middle balance, if it's a team project or if it's a solo project, like finding out what works for you or what works for the people in the team. Like, how do your personalities work?
The therapist doesn't know best, and although may have insight, because the therapist is giving you a different viewpoint of your story or narrative, but that insight is always, shared. And clinically, that's what happens at the beginning as well. So if you've got a good therapist and a good clinical practitioner, psychiatrist or psychologist, whichever practitioner it is, they would employ those techniques at the beginning to build that therapeutic alliance. Because without the therapeutic alliance, irrespective of what modality you use, what technique you use, it's not going to work. Occasionally, in very difficult situations, ethical considerations may really pose problems that need solutions, very particular solutions. But on the whole, a respectful, person-based understanding of what will be allowed and what won't is essential.
And let's keep in mind that these processes are not linear, that rebalancing power relationships can also stop at some point, and that we can actually have a reverse back into a relapse back into very centralized models. So it's not a given. But I do acknowledge that the way that relationship is evolving in general is extremely promising, also from a participatory theoretical perspective.
that's a problem with interactive media, is that many people prefer to be passive than to to contribute their own material. So you have to persuade the user that they have something significant to say, and that will become part. It will be it's a collaborative enterprise, and so they will be part of the creative team. So do they want to do that or not? Well, that's the contract. They have to accept that they are going to have to work.
Most people who tell stories drag from childhood. I would say I'm almost 100% on that. Childhood is like your most informative, part of your life. You spend a good chunk of your time, depending on where you class childhood as. But if you say up to sort of 12, you learn through games. You learn through TIG and hide and seek and all those kind of games. And I think they're deliberate. They're there to kind of like teach you, what is acceptable within the world and what's possible. And I think that's the sort of the grammar of how you engage with the world, I think is ingrained in childhood, and how you interact with the games that are there.
In video games, it's interesting because obviously the audience is a player, so they have agency, and sometimes you set up a world and a scenario, and they go off and do their own thing.
Every single thing within a scene tells a part of the story. It's like an orchestra. You've kind of got all your different kind of sections all working together to create an experience. And I think with film, it's obviously slightly different because you can control things, whereas with games, you can control things to a certain extent, but you're never quite sure what the player is going to do. So what you have to do, I guess, is kind of make sure every part of the environment that they're in, whatever that might be, whether it be a kind of flat game or whether it be a kind of big open world game, everything's got to communicate something.
With my game, before I forget, it was subverting the power fantasy of games, because we were telling the story of a woman with dementia, and so there were those expectations that people go into these spaces, like a gaming space. Is the expectation is that you start at a level of low competency, and by the end you'll be more competent, and you'll be super competent a lot of the time. We subverted that because that's not how dementia goes. Dementia actually goes the other way. So yeah, there are things like that. We're now at a point in games where we can subvert our own medium and explore play with player expectations. When you subvert expectations like that, going back to that sort of intentionality, when you subvert things with a very clear purpose and a goal, and you know why you're doing it, and you know what the effect's going to be, it can be really powerful.
Everybody plays the game the same way in terms of the way it functions, but I think everybody plays a game differently in terms of what they do, and it really depends on what the game is, depending on what the contract is.
Folktales was an escapism. It was a beautiful story in a beautiful place that you could never aspire to. You couldn't live in a place like that. You couldn't be part of it, but you could dream. And that's what it was. They were passing on dreams rather than just tales. You are keeping alive a tradition that has been around as long as speech. Knowing that the story that you are telling has been in the mouths of people for hundreds, thousands of years, you are just the most recent conduit through which the stories pass. Don't start thinking that you're God's gift, because you're bloody not.
She has dogs, so don't be scared of the dogs. They do yap. I came cycling in Orkney earlier this year, and I came across Lynn's storytelling centre. And she introduced me to a very powerful rendition of some older stories on Orkney, and I thought that they would be very interesting. So this seemed to me like the very start of an interactive practice, and I wanted to see more about what makes it tick.
The contract that you have between the storyteller and the listener is different online. I'd say the thing that doesn't translate particularly well is the physicality of storytelling, because a lot of storytellers move around a lot. You know, they might be actions, there might be stomping up and down, there might be waving your arms around. You can't do that when you're looking at a laptop screen. At its best and at its truest form, it's a live experience. You know, you're in the room, they're in the room. But the pandemic really turned a lot of that on its head. This whole community of online storytellers suddenly sprung up almost out of nowhere and started forming into groups, and it was almost like self-help. It was not out of a desire to be performing, it was out of a desire to connect to other people, to get through this.
I think we've learned a great deal about what works online and what could work online. This notion of a circle, from ancient times, we deal with this idea of a continuous circle and not breaking the circle, keeping things within a circle. People talked a lot about rhythm, pace and pattern, and I think we can learn from some of the rhythm, paces and patterns of traditional storytelling. A great deal of thought went into the creation of safety, making people feel okay, grounding them, holding them without restricting them. How we make people part of the setting is also really important, and more so when we have if you like, a veil that is between us and our audience. Being aware that we all hold deep in us some very familiar story traits.
The tide at my head and feet, the winds about my shoulders, nor the deeper home for me, nor the Selkie's lover be, nor the seabirds hear my cry, the windy world over, and so.
You have outlined three different threads in this film. First, there is the oral storytelling tradition, where you have a storyteller who has a story that comes from the ancestors, a well-established story, and the problem is through live interactions, to get the audience to step imaginatively into the world of the story. Then you have the idea of the carnival, where you have a subversion of rules. And the idea of the carnival is really that the individual people develop their own stories by, transgressing the rules of society. And then you have the model of the game, which is a collaborative model where every participant in the game, in a sense, creates his or her own story. So I think that the problem with your project is to bring these three threads together.
There has been a lot of research into different modes of writing and poetics. So Catherine Millard has looked at older forms of engagement in media and sort of said, think about what's useful to us now. Janet Murray has looked at the affordances of the computer and sort of mixing the computer, if you like, with cultural practices. So there's been quite a wide-ranging investigation, but there is still a lot to be done about the process and how you do this.
I know that we sort of touched on not necessarily online etiquette, but some of the problems inherent in online communications that are visible. And I think some of the storytellers talking about kind of delivering stories with love and loving the audience, all of that, we don't really talk about that in a work setting, in a kind of business of storytelling and media setting. But you only have to look at like the Beatles, for example, and how they infused all of what they did with some really kind of good feeling and love. And it's not beyond the bounds of possibility to suggest that that might be a good thing for us all, to tell stories with more love and love the audience more.
These different projects have been chosen because they are interactive, essentially, in a more obvious way. You could argue that novels are interactive as well, but we're kind of taking things which are obviously interactive and exploring that to see if there's something that we're missing, that we've missed out or overlooked in our investigations of how to create for new media practices.
I think that the notion of contract or pact is trying to be a political intervention, defending a particular type of participation. And we might actually agree on what kind of participation we would prefer. But from an analytical perspective, I think we need to be careful, because there is this wide variety of participatory intensities, Foucauldian power strategies, counter strategies, and endless negotiations. So I think the pact is maybe not analytical. I think it's normative. It's an area where you might want to go to. You might want to defend the need for a pact or a contract about participation. But analytically, I don't think it exists.